I'm Sharon Marcus. I'm a professor in the Department of English and Comparative Literature, also sometimes a cultural historian, which is how I come to organize an event that brings together two of, I think it's fair to say, the world's most eminent historians, certainly of modern Europe and modernity. And I want to begin by thanking everyone at the Committee for Global Thought and SOF Heyman, who helped to put this event together. We wouldn't be here without their expert assistance. And I'm simply going to introduce our two speakers and then step off to the side and let them begin their conversation. So we're here to discuss Deborah Cohen's most recent book. And Deborah Cohen is the Richard Leopold Professor of History at Northwestern University, where she is also currently the department chair. She is the author of 4 books that have won too many prizes for me to enumerate. So I'll simply say 4 prize-winning books: The War Come Home, Household Gods, Family Secrets, and Last Call at the Hotel Imperial. And you can tell, I think, from the titles alone, and most of you probably know her work as well, that she has been for a long time someone working the scene between the private and the public, the global and the intimate. And that is true, I think, perhaps more of her most recent book than of any of the others. Last Call at the Hotel Imperial has been praised for its prodigious research and sparkling prose. It's been called a masterclass in bringing together the global and the intimate, the personal and the political. And I think perhaps my favorite reviewer comment is that it's a great book about great and flawed people caught up in a world going mad. And that theme of a world going mad is, I think, what makes Adam Tooze the perfect interlocutor for this book. Adam Tooze is the Shelby Cullum Davis Professor of History here at Columbia, as well as the director of the European Institute. You probably also know him for his weekly podcast with Foreign Policy, his influential newsletter on Substack. Many of you probably read his most recent op-ed, and then it was sobering, in the New York Times of October 4th. And his book titles are The Wages of Destruction, The Deluge, Crash, and Shutdown. A series of titles that makes one a bit nervous about what his next book might be. Wouldn't be surprised if it were called something like Planetary Apocalypse, but as it happens, it is called Carbon, which may amount to the same thing. So without further ado, I will let Deborah and Adam begin their conversation, and I will come back to moderate the Q&A.
Well, thank you, Sharon. Thank you for hosting us here and the entire team at the Heyman Center, and for everyone showing up. And isn't this a funny thing for us to be doing? It's just a total delight to be in conversation with Deborah about her latest book. I think this is the first event, actually, of a book of either of us that we've maybe done together, that we've known each other since the beginning of our careers. And so it's just a total delight to be here. I think, Deborah, you're going to give us like a kind of a 10-minute pitch on some of the basic ideas and some of the things that mattered to you most about the book. And then we'll go into a conversation about how this whole thing came about.
Can you hear me? Okay, good. First of all, thank you so much to Sharon Marcus for organizing this, for making the invitation to the Heyman, for sponsoring it. Thank you, Eileen. And thank you to Adam for joining me for this conversation. And I want to say, because there's so many people in the present audience as opposed to the virtual audience who helped me along the way with this book. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Really would not have been possible without you. So what I'm going to do is just get about a 10-minute overview of the book, introducing some of the figures to you and talking about some of the main themes of the book. And then we'll go into Q&A. So Last Call at the Hotel Imperial is about a group of friends and sometimes rivals who became some of the most influential foreign correspondents of their day. John Gunther, Dorothy Thompson, H.R. Knickerbocker, and Vincent Sheean. Their names today aren't at all well known, but in their own moment, they were equally famous to their lost generation fiction writing counterparts, Fitzgerald and Hemingway. Between the 1920s and the 1940s, they reported from hotspots across the world. And really, they had in their reporting, they had two main stories. First of all, the rise of anti-colonial movements and eventually the triumph of anti-colonial movements taking on the European empires. And the second story was the rise of fascism and the coming of the Second World War. So my book is about a moment when American foreign correspondents became the kings of the hill. It's about the work for which they became very famous, which is a very personal journalism of warning that broke the rules about objectivity and reporting. It's about what journalists didn't see. It's about what they argued about. It's about the things that they got wrong, for instance, the nature of modern dictatorship. But it's also about what they saw, what they came to understand, some of it eerily prescient in our moment, the looming refugee crisis, the strange internationalism of fascist leaders who just kind of ostensibly disclaimed any kind of interest in international affairs and in fact created their own internationalism. At a time when appeasement and isolationism held sway, much of what millions of Americans knew about the world came from their reporting. The reporters in my book, though, had another story too, and that was about the collapse of the boundaries between inner life and geopolitics. So that's, as it were, that's their kind of third story. It's one that's thrust upon them more than one that they went out to find. By the 1930s, it no longer seemed sufficient to say, as Marx had, that history was moved on by impersonal material forces. They had seen for themselves how much a single leader, a single personality, had changed the course of a nation. The ascendance of a Hitler or a Stalin or a Gandhi, or we might say in our own time, right, a Putin or a Zelensky. The individual leader seemed newly to count for everything, nearly everything. The world crisis was happening because of them, and it was happening through them. And so that posed the question, who were these men, and why were millions of people following them into a future that they had dreamed up? The reporters in the book were influenced by the ambient Freudianism of their era, and they were also influenced by their start in the big city newsrooms of their youth with a kind of irreverent contempt for the oftentimes corrupt politicians, big city bosses they were reporting on. So they looked for the answer to this question about what made these men who they were through the kinds of stories that their editors mostly wouldn't allow to appear in the paper. Stories about unconscious urges, the psychological injuries of childhood, repression, frustrated sexual desires, and that sort of thing. What started off as an arm's length analysis very soon became personal. So they found themselves trying to explain the psychopathology of leaders, and very soon they were digesting those own dynamics they felt in their own relationships. It was as if the worldwide crisis has gotten inside of them. This story, so I would say this is their third story, this story would take shape in a set of pioneering memoirs. Among them, John Gunther's Death Be Not Proud, his 1949 book about the illness and death of his son, Johnny, again, quite an unprecedented book at the time. Or Vincent Sheean's book about the marriage of his friends, Dorothy Thompson and Sinclair Lewis, the 1963 Dorothy and Red. So what I want to do is introduce the main figures in the book for those of you who haven't read, just so you know who we're talking about. And I should be advancing it. What is it advancing? So, yeah, maybe that. There we go. Sometimes they have a delay, these systems. Okay, John Gunther. This is John Gunther. he got his story as a cub reporter at the city's prestigious afternoon and Chicago's prestigious afternoon daily, the Chicago Daily News. And there he was reporting on the kinds of stories that the novice in the newsroom got: Rotary Club lunches, the latest gangster shootout, remember it was Chicago. He left Chicago for Europe in 1924, and he would spend the next 12 years shooting between Damascus, Vienna, Berlin, Jerusalem. Those were just some of his most frequent destinations. The book that made his name was the 1936 Inside Europe, which is a behind-the-scenes account of the foibles of the dictators rising across the continent. Between the mid-1930s and the end of the 1950s, Gunther had more bestsellers, more US bestsellers than any author other than the romance novelist Daphne du Maurier, the author of Rebecca. Now, one of Gunther's closest friends were Dorothy Thompson, H.R. Knickerbocker, and Vincent Sheean. Knickerbocker was red-haired and wiry. He had shot out of Yoakum, Texas, snapping at facts like a terrier. He won the Pulitzer Prize in 1931 for his reporting on Stalin's first five-year plan. He interviewed everybody who was anyone, from Hitler to Mussolini, whom he interviewed 4 times, to Stalin's mother, whom he found in a hamlet in the Caucasus. This picture, by the way, comes from the Columbia Rare Books, the Columbia Archives, and from the Knickerbocker papers. And I have to say, when I first saw it, I thought, could it be? The third of the figures in the book, Vincent Sheean, otherwise known as Jimmy. By the time that Jimmy Sheean published his memoir, Personal History, in 1935, he was already well known for his reporting exploits in the mid-1920s amidst the Moroccan Wars, where he had reported on the anti-colonial campaigns of the Rifi leader, Abd al-Krim. So he is well known for his anti-colonial politics. The question that propelled Sheean's memoir, Personal History, was, as he put it, quote, how the individual person enmeshes with society, with the historical process of which she is a part. Personal History is a really crucial book. It would really set a generational template for the way to actually live an engaged life. And finally, Dorothy Thompson. Dorothy Thompson was the first American woman to lead a major overseas news bureau. And that is a distinction that she always disdained for its see what the little darling has done now attitude. By the late 1930s, she had an estimated audience of 8 to 10 million readers thrice weekly for her syndicated On the Record column. And this column, by the late 1930s, 3/5 of the columns were actually devoted to Thompson's anti-Nazi crusade. Her signature was an unabashedly emotional style. So critics quipped that she was the only woman in America to have her menopause in public and to make it pay. But as her friend Jimmy Sheean said, when FDR wanted to sway opinion, it was Dorothy whom he called. So these 4 reporters, together with John Gunther's first wife, Frances Feynman Gunther, a sometimes foreign correspondent, are the main figures of the book. And we'll undoubtedly get to talk about Frances Gunther later on, in addition to some other figures like William Shire, the New Yorker's Emily Hahn, and people like Edward R. Murrow. So I just want to close by situating a little bit of the historiographic contribution of the book. So this is a book that sits at the intersection, on the one hand, of the history of private life, and then on the other of international history. And I see the gain in that shared terrain as twofold. First of all, one of my aims was to try to open up the history of private life beyond the spheres of the personal and the domestic, which is where it's oftentimes been conducted. And I think that this is especially important for 20th century topics, given how pervasive the slippage was between intimate life and geopolitics. So one of the arguments that I'm making is that the drive to openness, which is really emblemized by the tell-all memoir, this drive to openness owes its origins to the 1930s rather than to the conventional explanations, which would place it in the sort of permissive liberationist 1970s or the narcissistic 1990s. In other words, the drive to openness comes from the conviction that directly really from the hellish world of the 1930s and 40s, that the individual needs defending and that the full range of human experiences need to be told. Second, what comes into sharper view, I think, by focusing on these journalists are their publics, are the audiences for whom they wrote. And what I hope that the book does is actually encourage more work into those audiences. These were mass global audiences of millions, so new audiences and certainly newly democratic audiences. I think we're just at the start of really understanding them. As Adam has pointed out in his chart book, we can see the interwar period as the sort of next phase in the famous argument that Benedict Anderson makes in Imagined Communities. Not that transatlantic communities are forged through novels and newspapers as in the 19th century, but now something new is happening, which is that the boundaries between inner and outer life are dissolving. That people come to the foreign policy ideas that they have, not as a matter of rational calculation or even ideology, but rather as a matter of feeling. That the media serves literally as the means of prying open their insides, of getting inside their souls. And small wonder that both Knickerbocker and Thompson were the children of ministers. Subjectivity, they would find, sold just as well as objectivity, if not better. So that's where I'll begin and really looking forward to talking.
Well, thank you, Deborah, for that, again, thought-provoking introduction to a book which is dazzling. I can't recommend it enough as a read. Maybe I can ask you perhaps the obvious question, which Sharon hinted at in a kind of typically clever way, like as it were papered over the question, because you say like Deborah's been concerned throughout her work with the relationship between the private and the public, the global and the intimate. And that suddenly made, okay, right, this is the connection. But at first glance, coming to this book in relation to your previous three, there's a sense of shock almost, or surprise. And here is Deborah that we know as a great historian of Europe and particularly of Britain, writing a very American story. In fact, even more when you said the city and you had to correct yourself and said, I actually mean Chicago. Quite a local, I mean, it really seems
that's posterism for you,
exactly,
right?
It comes immediately out of your current experience of living in Chicago and being so committed to the city. And can you tell us a little bit about the trajectory that took you to this new project? I can see private, public, global, intimate, that actually does work.
Yeah, I mean, I think the truth is that I always reverse engineer my historiographic, claims, and that. So, what did the book come out of? I think there was an archival. I'll speak about these individually, but there was an archival piece. There was a question of sort of big historical questions that I'd always been interested in. And then it turned into something else. And so, so the archival piece of this was that I was thinking I was going to do an article about Death Be Not Proud. So I had gone back, I'd reread it for a piece I wrote for the Wall Street Journal about books about parents and children. And I went to the archives, the Gunther archives at the University of Chicago, to read the correspondence that Gunther had received in response to this book. And a lot of it was from parents themselves who had children who were sick or had died or had been killed in the war. And that was all, I had long been interested in the trajectory of confessional culture from my book, Family Secrets. I'd long been interested in the kind of career of private lives lived in public, really from my senior thesis. So that was the beginning. And then I thought, I'm going to look around and see what else is in this archive. And it turned out that there's 150 unlisted boxes. So not even on the University of Chicago website right now, if you went and looked. So there was a formal kind of professional archive, and then there was a private archive. And in that private archive, John Gunther was in contact with every major world leader, you know, of the 20th century. So there were things like Jan Masaryk making jokes, a joking letter about the abdication crisis. And then there were all of Gunther's diaries and his letters. And I thought, wow, I mean, it was a way of seeing European history actually that I hadn't seen. And in a sense, it connected the history of empire because of the involvement in anti-imperial crusades, the history of fascism, authoritarianism in all forms. So that was the beginning. But I would say more generally, these people, they were interested in my questions. I felt like these were the questions that had always propelled me. I was always trying to understand how to see changes happen behind closed doors. What is the relationship between the individual and the world that they inhabit? And so I found myself completely sucked into their dilemmas.
That's a fascinating answer. I wonder whether we could talk a little bit more about the seductions of that archive and its richness, because you then go on to find other cache of paper to do with all of the other protagonists, and that, you know, provides you with a springboard to do something that I think most historians are profoundly uncomfortable with, which is to venture into the zone of essentially psychological interpretation and psychological. You propose a series of propositions and theses essentially about what is driving these people forward. And that is a gamble. What was it in particular about this source material that made you feel, I think it's always lurked, you've always wanted to do that in a sense, thinking about your earlier books, the temptation has always been there. And in fact, there has been a framing social psychological hypothesis almost always. But in this book, it's absolutely in the foreground. I mean, one sees you wrestling with these texts and these sources in a way that's extremely unusual for a historical. I mean, it reminds me of somebody like Carolyn Steedman or, you know, these true adventurers really in the outer edges of what a modern historiography might look like.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's right. So on the one hand, the archives themselves permitted this, or they encouraged it, they invited it, and that there was an enticement, but also a danger. So I'll talk about the enticement first, and then about the danger. So these are people reared in a sense, in a kind of Victorian rational framework, who come to understand that there is an unconscious, but they put all of that rationality to work and to try to understand that unconscious, meaning that they generate huge numbers of diaries, letters, little tiny scraps of paper with observations about their inner life. Of course, the privilege of working with that kind of stuff is that you at least have an account of how they see themselves, and then oftentimes how they see other people. The danger is that they know and they understand, and you have to understand that they're only giving this very partial account. And they're so psychologically aware. So John Gunther, after he writes, you know, tons and tons and tons of diaries, and then he says, of course, these don't get any part of my inner life. And you're like, what have I just been reading? If this isn't any part of the inner life, you know, what's really going on in the inner life? So there was that. So there was the archival piece of it. And then there was the thing that many people in this audience actually suffered through with me, for which my profound thanks, which is the attempt to actually how to write it so that you would get a sense exactly of that struggle. And that was, I had various expeditions into the close third person or free and indirect dialogue or discourse, in how to use dialogue that's quoted in the archive. I mean, my first attempt, which was a failure, was actually to try to kind of step back entirely and just for you, the reader, to know what they know at the moment at which they know it. And one patient person who I will not single out said essentially, nice try, but it's really not working. So she knows who she is. And so from there, we have all of these tools, of course, for the bird's eye view, for the contextual, and I just had to begin to weave those through while trying to keep something of what I was actually aiming to do.
Because another really striking thing about the book, as soon as you launch into it, you realize this is going to be a very different read, is the prose, is the pacing, is the style of the writing. Beyond the more abstract problem of how to, as it were, wrestle with these sources, there's also an incredibly conscious set of choices being made by you about how to deliver this narrative. And to my mind, it was thinking about it this morning, as I read the book many months ago now, and thinking about one of the impressions that was left was that the development it was almost like a Bildungsroman in the style itself, because you start out in this, sort of sassy, brassy, gunslinging, Chicagan, journalistic pulp kind of mode, which is, if you know Deborah well, this is definitely an aspect of Deborah's personality, and you kind of, it was a kind of joyous living out of all of that kind of rather retro 1920s manner, and then several days later, by the time I got to the Death Be Not Proud segment, I was reduced to tears. It was so affecting, but in the manner of the new objectivity. It was the account of the child's death has this lucid, unbearably lucid quality to it. The affectation has disappeared, and there's a sense in which, through your style, almost you capture the development of these people's personalities. This is the same John Gunther that came out of this essentially sophomoric kind of distinctive, it really does reminded me of pulp, 1920s American pulp magazine kind of feel. And was that a deliberate effect that you were looking for?
I'm so glad that you said that, because it's absolutely deliberate. So Gunther, I can quote equally sophomoric things from the other ones, but I'll just pick on Gunther for a moment, was famous for sending a series of letters to the same women. One of them, unfortunately, was also sent to Chesterton, who returned it to him, comparing their eyelashes to little fringed fans. So that was one of his things that he did. So yeah, the aim at the beginning is to give you this sense of, the wised up flapper Argot, and then to end with the sobriety tragedy, the sort of trapped by your circumstances conclusion. And
like cancer.
Yeah, right. So one of the things I wanted to do was with that, with Death Be Not Proud, for instance, I'd read so many of those letters. So these are the letters that other parents write to Gunther and to Francis Gunther to say things like, my experience, my minister told me I shouldn't talk about this anymore. This is after the death of a child or the death of someone, that it was time to put that away and to continue on. And this was the first time that I have actually read something that represents my experience. But rather than just to say that, in the historian voice, I said that in the historian voice, but what I really wanted to do was to give you one of those letters, but not to quote it, but to do something that I learned from Deborah Baker, which is actually to basically metabolize it, right, in a form. And so, yeah, and there was a lot of back and forth about, does that work? Does it not work? Some people thought it worked. Some people thought it didn't work. It's in there. So you can decide for yourself. But yeah, that was exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to do, part of their enterprise was turning the spotlight on inner life of the people who they were trying to write about. So I wanted to do that too.
And maybe we'll come later on to the extraordinary irony that Jimmy Sheean, the most hell-raising of the entire group, who by rights should have died several times by 1945, is the figure who in the end ends up reflecting on all of them in retrospect. Maybe we could talk a little bit more about this, the way in which you situate this group you know, in a more conventional historical frame, like where do they fit in the story of the interwar period? I'm delighted that this idea I had of seeing them as the next phase, a century on from Benedict Anderson's famous idea about the emergence of a modern historical subjectivity and consciousness, and also a collective unconsciousness through modes of fiction and newspapers, and this being the next stage. And I'm glad that rings true. That certainly for me is one of the huge takeaways, that this problem, somebody like Jürgen Habermas, for instance, grossly understates the complexity and problems of the new public sphere of the 20th century, because he sees it only as a degeneration of that higher form of the 19th century towards the yellow press, and, you know, on from there to Axel Springer and Rupert Murdoch and the nightmares of the current internet. Whereas what you're showing us is the way in which this public sphere still remains incredibly creative, potentially, and to this, you know, in a sense, irreducibly challenging all the way down to the present day, because these people challenges, to my mind, struck me as totally contemporary. All the questions they're asking strike me. So I'm delighted that rings true to you. But I'm by no means a literary historian, but in the text, you also position them against another narrative, right, of the American world of letters, which is against the lost generation narrative. You know, F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway, as you put it, drinking their anomie away at a Parisian cafe. I mean, these people certainly do a great deal of drinking, but they're not escaping from anything, right? And that I thought was a very important, not escaping from anything at all. Very important kind of point that you're making about this group.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, so the historian Brooke Blower has written very well about the lost generation and the politics of the lost generation. And so I see that point is very much following in her footsteps. So, right, so how to position them? So on the one hand, they're a counterpart, a nonfiction counterpart to fiction writers who also write nonfiction. They are, every one of them, avowedly political, unlike, say, someone like Hemingway, who has a very ambivalent relationship to politics. But the broader context is everyone in the 20s and 30s who is thinking about the relationship between the individual and the collective, which is pretty much everyone, I think. And that is, you know, Sartre, the phenomenologists, Ora Benjo, they're drawing on all of these people. I don't know so much, you know, Sheean would have been, I think you and I corresponded about this, Sheean would have been reading, because he was, as every person who I interviewed about him said, he was the real intellectual in the group.
Because he translated Croce.
He translated Croce, exactly. But the rest of them are also distilling for the mass market, and the mass part of it is hugely important, and hence their influence. All of this range of so people who are trying to understand, we're coming up with solutions to their versions of the Soviet challenge. So what do you make of, you know, does the individual matter at all in mass society? The question of experience, how important is experience? What can you understand beyond your own experience? And I think that is their context with a really important mass market translation.
I've been tempted by this all along, that in a sense, they're a fascinating kind of middle brow, but all the more effective because positioned in that space, alternative to, take your pick, like Merleau-Ponty, Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir on the French side, and on the other hand, critical theory, Herbert Marcuse on the German side of the fence, right? In the sense that all of these questions of the personal as political, the role of sexuality and sexual identity and desire as key elements of broader structures of power, repression, and so on, are there in their writing, but in this quaffable, kind of agreeable mid-Atlantic mode, which both of the others very, very deliberately avoid. I mean, and they have some sort of Heideggerian suspicion for the obviousness of these people's accounts, but by virtue of that, also in a radical distance from the reading of everyday people in the vast majority of places. Whereas these folks, in their own way, and also through their lived example, I mean, Dorothy Thompson's sex life is extraordinary. The woman just takes who she wants, as far as one can tell from your narrative. Like it's an explosive display of a kind of liberated subjectivity.
Absolutely correct. And I think that the interesting move that they make, and they don't all do it, but Thompson is a very good example of this. The interesting move she makes is to address the reader as if she understands what they are feeling, because they are feeling what she is feeling. And one of the things that she's saying is that politics used to stop at the doorstop, at the threshold of the house. Now it doesn't. Now it's invasive. Now it's all over the place. She says, before, just on the eve of the war, do you feel as I do? You know, the sinking feeling as if all the world and everyone in it, and you and I and everyone are going crazy, and are affected to the sort of to our root. So rather than kind of standing apart, she's interpreting herself in a sense as someone who can feel these things, which everyone else is also feeling, and then write about them in a digestible fashion that people will then see their experiences reflecting. Sheean does this as well in personal history. And by his own account, he gets, and these letters unfortunately don't survive, but by his own account, he gets a ton of letters saying, yes, this is exactly what I've always been feeling. Again, a resonance to the Death Me Not Proud letters as well. So I think this is a crucial element of sort of where they stand. And as I said, for that reason, they direct attention to the audiences and to try to, what can we understand about these audiences?
So then now what you just said prompts another thought. I don't know why I didn't think of this earlier in our earlier conversations. I mean, how about the Bloomsbury group as a group of interlocutors? Because when you say, you know, thinking that, as Thompson puts it so well, I would just, you know, politics can't stop at the bedroom door, right? It has to go everywhere. The person I immediately think of is Keynes, because Keynes has this extraordinary essay from the late 1920s where he says if liberalism can occupy the sex question in all its form, especially contraception, and the drugs question, narcotics, you know, liberalism will have the 20th century. It will be an unstoppable force if only it can occupy those two spaces. And there's never, Thompson never interviewed Keynes. There's no Thompson-Keynes dialogue, is there? But more seriously, what is the relationship of this group with the Bloomsbury circle?
So Thompson probably did interview Keynes, though not on that subject. I think more on his, you know, his view of economic policy and political economy. So they have very close relationships to the Bloomsbury group, or rather specifically, Vincent Sheean, Jimmy Sheean does. So he basically becomes, Sheean is born in the mining town of Pana, Illinois, which is population of 7,500, fewer today. Goes to the University of Chicago. Within a decade, he is the lover of Eddie Sackville West, busy in the tower room at Knoll. So this meteoric rise, I mean, actually hard to imagine, except by some kind of force of personality. And also the fact that it was handy to have sex with men if you were trying to break into the Bloomsbury group. Well, it's true. I mean, it's a way to, you know, yeah. And a lot of the work of, so one way of putting it is a lot of the discussions that are happening private in Bloomsbury are being magnified and projected out into the world through Sheean. So the reason why Sheean writes personal history to start off with is because Harold Nicholson, who's a very good friend of his, and has a crush on Sheean, as everyone does, is writing his own account of the Paris Peace Conference and says, you know, you should do it too. And everyone, you know, lots of reviewers say, you know, an autobiography at age 35, you know, imagine the chutzpah of that. But one of the things that Sheean is doing is taking those kinds of debates that he's had, you know, with Eddie Sackville West. He's then the lover of Duncan Grant as well. So he's firmly anchored into that milieu, and that's absolutely right.
Maybe another way of thinking about these people in the group that you single out is by way of key partners in their lives who ghost through the book in many, far more than ghosting through in the case of Francis Gunther's, who I think we should talk about in a minute, but are the sort of foil, provocation, and in Sheean's case, I think really the inspiration for his most influential book. So it's the figure of Raina Prohm. Is that how to say her name?
Yeah, who's
a communist, right? So in a sense, the more extreme versions of the politics which these people espouse are in many cases represented by significant others for them. And in this case, it's a significant other who is an actual card-carrying member of the Communist Party.
Yes, so I think that that's right, that there are sets of duets throughout the book. And in a way, the big leitmotif that runs through is precisely the marriage of the Gunthers and marriage in general and creative work and intellectual work. So Raina Prohm is a communist. She is the figure in Personal History against which Jimmy Sheean is writing. He's sort of caught between the sybaritism of Bloomsbury and the self-denying communist who is Raina. And his politics then come from what he's trying to do is figure out what's the path through. Like, if I don't want to be either one of those two things, what is left for me? And what is my place in the world? Should I talk about Francis? Yeah. So
maybe we come to Francis in a minute. Francis's politics become urgent and crucial in locating them at a slightly later stage. But in the interaction between Sheean and Prohm, the question of praxis is posed, right? Part of Sheean's agony is that he is this radical, not a communist, but nevertheless a radical, and not, as it were, a self-indulgent liberal aesthete, and yet knows that he's not a political activist. And unlike Raina Prohm, who was and pays with her life ultimately for her convictions in some complicated way, the body features again in this text. You know, what did she die of? You know, was it, as it were, his responsibility? Did he help bring on her crisis that ultimately killed her? Or was it some latent disease that was always going to knock her out? That struggle goes on in his mind, doesn't it? And it resolves itself into this question of, how odious am I if I am not actually in the business of pursuing the world revolution at this moment? Can I live with myself if I'm not?
right. And what is my work as a journalist if I'm not going to pursue the world revolution? Do I have some work? So Personal History ends with Raina Prohm. She's died tragically in Moscow right after the 10th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution festivities. And then Sheean is left with, as you say, this huge amount of guilt, but also he is a sybarite, right? He is absolutely the man in the white linen suit, which is the way that she portrays him. And his question is, what is the function of my writing then? And this is a question that runs through the entire book, which is, what is the function of journalism? The objectivity question is evergreen in reporting. So these people represented a moment when objectivity was something that was enshrined in the newsroom of the early 20s, the respectable newsroom of the early 20s. And they're constantly confronting the whole question of what's the relationship between a group of facts and the truth. And sometimes that relationship, this is the both sidesism issue of today, is pretty distant. And they're trying to figure out to what extent can the journalist become an actor in history? And that is ultimately actually what they all want to be. I mean, Dorothy Thompson is the person beating the drum for intervention, for American intervention. Sheean himself has a way of trying to reconcile Soviet interests and Western liberal democratic interests, and for Gunther, he has more modest hopes. He wants to carry a message backwards and forwards, that creates peace, or that is, somehow, more situational.
Sorry about being bossy about reserving Frances Gunther, because it seems to me that she really does diagnostically help us to anchor the way the book moves. Because if you think about the problem of this group in the 1920s, and if you read Sheean in the 1920s, for those like Susan and I who are in the business a little bit of rehabilitating the 1920s as a space of effective international liberalism, it's disillusioning read, because like many other people at the time, Sheean despairs of the League of Nations and all of the cant and hypocrisy, and it's that kind of a deeply disillusioned position, which does, I think, for liberals or people who, let's say, are not comfortable with either a communist or a fascist position, leave you in this uncertain space. And so when you then confront the passionate, romantic dynamism, I mean, Rainer Prohm and Jimmy Sheehan, they meet in China, right? Yeah, so I mean, these are like globe-trotting intellectuals of the revolution. And when you say she died in 1927 at the anniversary festivities, this is the 10-year anniversary of Bolshevism, and it's the hottest ticket in town. Like, everyone in the world needs to be at the fireworks party where they're going to recreate the revolutionary drama of 1917, because they've outlived the Paris Commune by that point by 10 years, which is Lenin's benchmark. And there you are as a liberal in a linen, white liberals, the liberal in the white linen suit, cavorting with your Bloomsbury friends, and you are not really in it. And then your woman, your girl, she dies in your arms, effectively, in the back of the cab that you're driving around in the cold when she should have been in hospital. Right? So that's your dilemma. And that really does pose this question of what have you done and what are we to do? And in a sense, they're saved by Hitler, aren't they? I mean, they're saved by the lack of ambiguity, the clarity of the anti-fascist cause. Certainly for Thompson, this answers all her questions. All the ducks line up. You basically get into a kind of supercharged, liberal, essentially, I think it's fair to say, feminist kind of Atlanticism that says that we must be part, as active citizens, as women and men, in the project of defeating Hitler. And everything for this charge, and that's a simplification which many liberals go through in this period. Keynes has the same thing. Keynes stands against World War I. Right? Keynes is a conscientious objector in World War I. Serves in the British state because he feels he has to, and it's his duty. But then writes the classic denunciation. But in World War II, lay down your arms, sign up, unambiguously associate yourself with the anti-fascist cause. It seems to me there's a sort of reconciliation there, which Frances Gunther is she is the fly in the ointment, because that woman is never reconciled.
That is, yes. So for three of the people in the book, and part of what I wanted to do is to show the ways in which this group as a group of friends actually fall apart precisely over this issue of the entrance of the United States into the war. So for three of the four who I've talked about, the three of the five, it's clear. For Knickerbocker, for Sheean, for Thompson, the US, this is the world fight. The US must be in it. Sheean, all of his sort of wishy-washiness about Soviet communism, he puts aside finally, and writes a famous denunciation of the Soviet Union in the New Republic in 1939. But Frances and John Gunther are a different story. So Frances Gunther essentially has come to a diagnosis of the world situation, which goes something like this. The problem is the British Empire. At the heart of all of the difficulties of figuring out the future is the refusal of the British elite to actually join Europe in some sort of rational way. If the United States actually joins this crusade, what they're doing fundamentally is, once again, as in the First World War, subordinating American ideals to the British Empire. And that goes to essentially that leads her into an adamant isolationist position. By the way, isolationism, a word that Contra Wertheim, she claims as her own. It's not something that she's branded with. It's something that she actually takes on and is proclaiming. John Gunther then is kind of plunged into the whole dilemma of what to do. He's very influenced by his wife's thought. He's worried about the war. And so he takes the kind of classic route that you would expect from the arguments that I'm making in the book, which is, what does he do? He actually has an affair with his best friend's wife. So that's the solution. You don't know what to do about the war, then there are other adventures.
If I may add a rider on that, and Francis, of course, is involved in a romantic relationship with Nehru. So, I mean, in both their cases, they live out this realignment, you know, fully consistent with your thesis about their understanding of world history. I mean, this position is, after all, not eccentric. If you allow the significance of Indian nationalism, which, I mean, hell, I was.
The position isn't eccentric at all. I mean, it anticipates a lot of the historiography, and what you can say, Francis she's not right about the comparison between the evils of the British Empire and the evils of, you know, National Socialism. But she is more right than people think at the time, certainly, or more right than her critics. Obviously, a lot of other people, you know, are also adamant.
Well, at least true to a certain critical position that many of them adopted in the 1920s, which was a sort of, you know, damnation on all your houses, a kind of equal opportunities criticism of imperialism as such, which is the, you know, the radical liberal cliche really coming out of 1914.
Absolutely.
You stick with that, you end up, as the left all the way down to the present does, you know, if you really want to hurt an editor of the New Left Review, you ask them what position they take on World War II, and many of them will end up in a position that is very similar to hers. Which is it's a tough stance, but I mean, its location is in. I mean, it's really significant that she finds almost unerringly in your, like, the place in which politics and world history will intersect with the personal is in a relationship with Nehru. Like, I mean, you couldn't do it more perfectly than that.
So thank you. And I think if you have more discussion you want to have with each other, you should definitely bring that in. But I also want to make some space now for questions from our live audience. I'm looking at the computer where the virtual audience sits for me. So if there are many people attending virtually, and if you send a question through the Q&A or through the chat, I should be able to see it. But we'll start with questions from the audience that is present in the physical space. Yes.
And so forth. But it sounds as if these poor people or five people left Chicago, got on a ship, ended up in Paris, started with Hitler and Mussolini and did they act to the language or knowledge of Europe?
Yeah, so it varies is the answer. So Gunther is the worst of the linguists, so he has great trouble. I mean, he has passable German, but his attempt to learn Russian is pretty non-existent. Sheean is a very good linguist. So in Pana, Illinois, taught by the village priest and taught by the greengrocer. He knows both French and Italian. He then picks up German. He's able to communicate to some degree in Mandarin. He then has a smattering of Russian as well. Knickerbocker has pretty decent Russian and perfect German, flawless German. Oh, and Thompson has very good German, but quite kind of ungrammatical. Everyone always comments on it. She just sort of headlong goes. She mixes up the formal, the informal. She calls the dog of the foreign minister the formal you. She calls the foreign minister the informal.
I have a naive question. So from where I sit, I don't keep up very much with the historiography on this period. It's understood as the 20th century is the century where America sort of imposed itself on the world, both on Europe through World War II, through the Marshall Plan, and on the global South and current and decolonizing countries. But listening to this exchange, I almost feel like, could we rethink the 20th century as the one where Europe ended up infiltrating the United States. I mean, it feels like American as these figures are, and they are so American. The story you're telling, not necessarily intentionally, I think, but what comes through for me is that it was all about Europe, whether it's ideas like psychoanalysis or just the events in Europe. Like, maybe we should turn this around and say the 20th century is when the United States just succumbed to the rest of the world. And maybe people have been saying that for a long time. I don't know.
So, right. So there are arguments about Americanization versus the globalization or cosmopolitanization of the United States. And this group of figures, obviously, they're bringing something of the feuilleton culture of Central Europe back to the United States in their reporting. That's one good example. They stand at the heart of a dilemma, which is to what extent was American power always kind of there, waiting to be activated as industrial might? And Adam should come in on from the deluge about this. And to what extent does the sort of American ascendancy depend on the Second World War? And they let us have, I think, a kind of, and this is why their audiences are so crucial, I think, is they show us a degree of engagement that certainly belies the now discarded old chestnut of an isolationist US public hiding behind their high walls of the ocean.
I think this is a great question. And I think you have to probably see both sides of the equation as dynamic. I mean, there was that great book by the Austrian historian Wagenleitner from decades ago now called Coca-Colonization, which posited precisely that, in a sense, through the Marshall Plan, a European fantasy returned to Europe. The Marshall Plan is, in fact, the European fantasy of endless abundance, cornucopianism realized. You can trace that through in much more sophisticated ways. I mean, I think if you want an index, in the cultural sphere, the location of the global art market is probably the most sensitive and obvious. And it's clear that it doesn't shift to New York until the 50s. And when it does, it shifts by way of European migrants, Latin American European migrants, who constitute then an authentically American art in abstract expressionism, which then, as we know, becomes a vehicle for a non-communist vision of a radical culture. But what Deborah is showing us is the intercourse that's happening at an earlier stage, which is in a similar space and in which Freudianism is circulating in American media. So I think your instinct is absolutely right, that this hugely complicates a simple narrative, which the only dimension in which you can really establish the simple narrative is in the sphere of finance, not the economy as such, right? Because American troops in World War I were shipped to Europe basically naked. All the Europeans wanted was the American man flesh. They just wanted strapping Ohioans who'd been fed properly, which were in very, very short supply in Europe by that point. They didn't come with equipment because America couldn't manufacture any equipment. They fought with French equipment. I mean, the things they brought were uniforms to an extent, but even those were generally derived from British sources. But all of their equipment is European and mass-produced in Europe. So the Fordist story is later. And hits really in that 40s, 50s moment. The thing that is unambiguously present is Hollywood on the screen. And even that, of course, is the product of a massive European-American synthesis. And the single truly unambiguous thing is the dollar. But where you locate JP Morgan in the Atlantic before World War I is, again, anyone's guess. It's clearly anti-Semitic and anti-German. But whether it's British or American in any simple sense of the word, the Federal Reserve is ultimately going to decide this. And so the emergence of, but it's a very thin, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's an incredibly thin form of hegemony, not absent. That all of those stories are bad. But I mean, Schmidt isn't wrong, right? When he comments on America as this absent presence, this looming absent presence over the entire, as a fantasy too. Still, Europeans would still have migrated en masse to America if they'd had the chance in the interwar period. Certainly through the early 1930s, when unemployment in America becomes insupportable. So yeah, I think that that's another way, I think, maybe of reading this book, right? Because the 1940s version of these authors is more authentically American than where they started out.
Or it's reflecting the turn to confessional culture that is they're importing from the Bloomsbury experience also. I mean, I think that's happening. Another thing that's though happening in the newspaper zone is that the European newspapers, their reporting on America is incredibly sparse. It's actually shocking. There's the historian Sean Nicholas has calculated that the British have, there's 7 British journalists reporting on the United States in the 20s and 30s. It's just, I mean, that includes the BBC journalists, so a handful of them.
Britain doesn't upgrade its consulate in the United States to full embassy status until the 1890s.
But
America wasn't considered dignified enough. Posting to the Ottoman port, it was like vastly higher status to the
But
posting.
you'd think that by the 20s and 30s, right? That you would think you would probably have a full-time correspondent in Washington, but no, there aren't those people. And so for that reason, these journalists these American journalists are the numerically largest foreign contingent in every capital in Europe and Asia. And that is partly because a group of newspaper proprietors think it's important for Americans to actually understand what's going on abroad.
Susan?
This is a kind of, this is a little bit of a change of tone or topic, but I wondered if you could talk a little bit about about Death Be Not Proud, because it functions for you to kind of change the tenor of the book and to change the tone of the book. And it works so beautifully to put, to get you out of the 1920s mode and into something else. But there's a kind of, I confront this all the time myself when working on these kinds of things. There is a sort of accidental quality to the fact that somebody has a child die at that precise moment, right? So, and so I wondered how you, and what prompted this is in the First World War, of course, there's endless death of children memoirs, often spiritualist memoirs. The child comes back. When I was doing research, I found also boxes and boxes and boxes of letters from grieving mothers who said, you captured exactly.
This is to Lodge, right?
Yeah. Well, no, it's actually to Winifred Coombe Tennant, who writes a, memoir of her dead son, too, dies first day in La Somme, right? And so I wondered how you thought of that quite delicate thing of mobilizing that private story to do both private and kind of tenor of the times work, but also more precisely what is different about the 40s story, which in this case is a cancer memoir, basically, and the World War I story, which catapults, which catalyzes all that kind of outpouring of grief in the same way. And
so I don't think it's the same way. I mean, I think it's a really
Okay.
good question, but I don't think it's the same way. First of all, the majority of those are privately published in memoriam volumes. There are those
Right.
that are published. So first of all, the big distinction is the difference between writing about illness and writing about death. Because what Gunther does in Death Be Not Proud is he writes an account, a secular account of an illness in a dispassionate tone. And it's not medical exactly, but it's definitely not religious. And so any kind of spiritual attachment, none of that is happening. Rather, what is the brain tumor? The brain tumor, Johnny's brain tumor, is the functioning of the same dynamic he sees in Vienna. That's what he says in the book. So explicitly, again, connecting the kind of inner life and actually corporeal to geopolitics.
The Vienna of the interwar.
Pardon?
When you say the same logic as playing out in Vienna, the Vienna
Of the interwar period. Yeah. So this is distinctively different from the in memoriam volumes, because of course those have been circulating. They have circulated for the Victorians, then they're given a big shot in the arm by the First World War. There's some of them that are printed, but if you look at the entire corpus of American memoirs, 6,000 memoirs published in this period from the 1890s to 1940, there are 13 memoirs about illness. I mean, that's it. And so Harper and Brothers, Gunther's publishers say, we cannot print this book. I mean, that's their first response. He writes it, they say, no, this is too private, too intimate. it is in bad taste. And that's the way that some reviewers read it as well. So I think the claim that this is a landmark book it is distinguishable from that sort of earlier outpouring. But there's something that you're getting at, which is, so isn't this, it's a kind of classic cultural history problem, right? Something just like comes up but how systematic is this? And I think I'm focusing on a group of people, but I think if you broaden it out to think about a group of Americans who have some kind of understanding, or, the Beauvoir circle, who spend their lives thinking about the relationship between the individual and the collective, who are upfront, face to face with the politics of the 20s and 30s. This is their turn to this kind of confessional writing is really different. And so, like, the first memoir of institutionalization and alcoholism, Willie Seabrook, he's a lost generation guy. F. Scott Fitzgerald writing about the crack up, again, a book that is thought to be unpublishable. So I think that you could go through those early confessional memoirs and say, it's, I haven't made the argument in a systematic way, but I think it could be made more systematically. Yeah, as I said, one of the things is that this objectivity question, the critique of both sidesism is something that someone like Sheean is making really in the 1930s. So it's striking how little there is that's new about the ways in which people are couching this dilemma and what is the proper role for journalism. I would say that what delays, in as much as anything delays their analysis, it's the confrontation with the phenomenon itself and trying to make sense of it. So they, like many other people, misperceive, or they understand only a piece of what modern dictatorship actually looks like. And what you can see through their work is people sort of trying to fumble to some sort of understanding. And here the contrast between Mussolini and Hitler for someone like Knickerbocker, who's a very astute analyst, he sees the dangers of National Socialism very early on. He reports on the famine in the Ukraine very early on. Mussolini, he thinks, what's really important is to make sure that that Hitler and Mussolini do not join forces. And so that means that his attitude he doesn't see a unitary fascism, even after the Axis is proclaimed. He still sees the possibility of very, very real possibility of actually peeling Mussolini away from this path.
And again, you could say he's not entirely wrong.
No, he's not entirely wrong. And the part of the story that, at least for me, was, in a way, the revelation was the crucial role that the Austrian Republic and the dissolution of the Austrian Republic, the rise of Austro-fascism played. Because though I had, many times given that interwar Austrian lecture, when you see it from the perspective of the people of the time, what you see is that for them is the beginning of the end. Or as Rebecca West said, this is something new. This is mass against mass. And this is the rise of the embryos, which is the way that she refers to Mussolini and Hitler and Stalin.
And Vienna is also a vision of the good, right? Vienna's public housing, the climactic scene of the struggle between the socialist left in Vienna, which is actually fought out in the model housing projects, is the emblem, right? When you have artillery pointed at children's creches, civilization is itself.
Yeah, and even someone who is anti-statist like Dorothy Thompson sees Viennese social democracy as entirely to the good.
Hi, I wanted to ask a very broad question that comes out of your interest in the articulation between geopolitics and intimate life. And I know you're interested in these questions, and you've said you want to teach a course about them. And so the issues that you address in this book bring up, and you mentioned another period, the 1960s, and obviously for us, they all have resonances today. And those are three periods in which you have some kind of geopolitical crisis and some kind of accompanying explosion of concerns about intimate life. And I wondered if you have come to think about this as some sort of pattern, or whether you would resist going that kind of social sciencey route and say, no, each of these moments has its own logic, and we shouldn't start saying that there are these echoes or similarities.
I mean, I think I would do both, which is to say that I think it's no accident, as you say, and you put it well, that to which you could add the 18th century as well, and the revolutionary period in particular. And that I think that would actually, at least as I'm envisioning it, that would be part of the argument of the class, which is the ways in which the sort of intimate life, inner life becomes related to geopolitics. And sometimes that begins as, the king is the patriarch of the household. So there's that kind of simple model to begin with. And then it becomes increasingly fraught under revolutionary pressures. So, I mean, yes, they all have their own dynamics, and there's an accretion of the logic that is, adumbrated with each individual one. I think that that's happening too.
But could we dig into this absolutely fascinating question and think through, may I crudely call it like the mechanisms of this interconnection, or the channels, or the metaphoric routes, or because you've just given us one, which is the sense of, that there could be an analogy between clearly is an analogy between patriarchal visions of power and sovereignty, conventionally understood. And Keynes was very sensitive to this too. He talked about the end of the gold standard as being about, abolishing the king in the form of gold, right? And so that runs through. What are the other channels? I mean, there's this extraordinary bit where Sheean in 36, I think, as the uprising of the nationalists, Franco's nationalists against the Spanish Republic, comes onto the horizon and then actually breaks out. He suffers a full-on mental breakdown. He's been drinking too much anyway, he later says, but he also basically goes into a sort of psychosomatic shock, right? People think he's going to die. So there's almost a kind of an embodied commitment to an order or vision of progress. I mean, what are the different mechanisms through which this works its way through?
Right, there's metaphor, which is the old ordering metaphors of the Ancien regime. I mean, this is actually really helpful. Maybe I will teach this course next year after all. And then I'll say it was all worked out here. There is, I think that then you have the question of the strict division of private and public, which we know is breached in the practice, but nonetheless the rhetorical and ideological commitment to the idea that there is private and there is public of the 19th centuries. And then the ways in which the two world wars and the rise of authoritarian regimes almost necessarily collapse those boundaries between private and public. So there's this sort of material, so there's, rhetorical material, as you say, symbolic, embodied. And with the embodied one, this is where I don't know enough. I mean, I don't know enough to say whether this kind of embodied experience that Sheean claims to have. And of course, so Sheean disdains psychoanalysis. He has no interest in it. He calls it a symptom of disease rather than of intellectual activity, partly because he is someone who is constantly being hauled into the psychoanalysts. When he has one of these mental breakdowns. Instead, what he sees is himself as the tuning fork of the university's ills. Or as Martha Saxton said when wrote to me about the book, that's the porosity, actually, of someone like Sheean that is so striking. And I think that, that porosity, so Gerald Haxton, who was Somerset mom's lover also is really interested in these ideas about the embodied. And part of that also comes from Aurobindo, I think. So I think there's a story that's about, you know, South Asian influences here in terms of what people are reading.
I was wondering whether you might add two more. I mean, they're cruder categories, but one would be the political. In other words, people are forced to make choices. And this can be, as you said, within this group, not necessarily within the couples, but within the group, within this friendship circle, the choices people make are contingent. And so you can opt different ways. Dorothy Thompson for the coalition, the others against. In other words, the anti-fascist coalition. I guess, and then the other one would be more kind of material logic, right? The way in which, if you think about the pandemic and its impact on people's private lives, it wasn't metaphoric. It was the stresses of lockdown. So there's a way in which a certain level of turmoil in the global system just changes the material circumstances under which relationships are formed in an explosive way. I mean, those are very crude mechanisms.
No. I mean, I think that both of those are true. I mean, there's Arthur Schlesinger says something about the 1939 to 1941 moment in the United States, which is that this is the time when friendships are most challenged, precisely over the question of intervention or not. And that, yes, so the political is always the forcing ground for precisely these kind of fragmenting events in personal relations. And certainly, I mean, the book is full of those.
So in following this thread, you've been mostly talking about the ways that the personal comes to reflect the political and the porosity between them. Are there moments in these people's stories where the personal is a sort of bulwark against the political and they're trying to insist on the difference between them, where their sexual choices or their personal choices are ways of resisting what they see happening in the world?
I think they think about it as a juggernaut, that it's actually, they can't resist it, or rather Dorothy Thompson has a really great essay, the 1937 Dilemma of the Liberal, where she says, essentially, there is no more private life, and that the whole world in which I live and everything in it bears in on me. And I have a husband and a child, but they're of secondary importance. And everything about them is being refracted.
So then at the end of the day, the individual dissolves.
And that's precisely right. Their reconstruction effort is both individual. So John Gunther says after the war, I'm reconstructing myself. He writes it to his girlfriend. But the reconstruction effort, and again, this is much broader than them, right? What is the name of that book? It's a bestseller. It's Dueling with Inside USA, Gunther's book. It's written by a rabbi, and it's something called the something of peace. But it's basically an argument for the ways in which the human self needs to be reconstructed. That this is the focus. This has to be the focus of the reconstruction effort. And that's partly what I see them doing with this memoir literature. Again, much bigger than they, but crucial.
I mean, to pick up on Sharon's point, to give it another framing, you could think surely of the politics of Christian democracy or late phase Stalinism as being a political appropriation of, Sharon posited this as a logic of the protection of the private sphere against the forces of the world, which could be thought of as emancipatory with a small e, right, in the sense that it's trying to harbor a space of a different set of relations. And after all, one could, in a normative mode, criticize somebody like Dorothy Thompson for the effective abandonment of her family, right? I mean, if you wanted to go that way, right, she makes choices. I mean, she says that her entire life is political, but that, in her case, is clearly a choice, right? I mean, it's and she's a deeply ambitious person and driven to pursue this, right? But there are obviously, if you think about the inner emigres of Nazi Germany, I mean, these are people who chose to pull back from the public sphere or completely redirect their lives away from the exposed political space to the commercial space. If you think about the way in which people navigate modern China or modern India, they're making choices to move into the personal and into the more deeply out of the political zone because the risks are so large. And then there is a politics which is parasitic on that, which is Christian democracy, which says, and that is the proper order of things, ladies
Totally,
and gentlemen.
yes.
This is how we're going to remake this. And that's how we restabilize, right?
Right,
Because
right.
these people here may be fascinating, but they're toxic. I mean, look at their
Right.
private lives. They're all drug addicts, alcoholics, promiscuous. Their children have terrible lives. Like, this isn't a model. This is a
Yeah.
disaster.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
This is a backlash. Well, it sets up the backlash.
No. This is, okay, so there's stages, right? I mean, I am really interested in the inner immigration and have always been interested in this. I think the kind of fortified private sphere that people try to create amidst the destruction is so partial until you get after the war. And then I agree with you entirely. You can say there's a realism in foreign policy that is mirrored by an objective style. We don't want any of all of this kind of wayward emotionalism. The women in particular are shut down. So Rebecca West, Dorothy Thompson, they are no longer people who you read after the war. So yes, I agree that that's happening. But I don't know how possible it is in the heat of the 30s, fundamentally, right? It's something that happens afterwards. And, you know, the CDU project of the reconstruction of that defended private space is really successful. And it's not just the Christian Democrats, right? It goes way beyond that. So just to say thank you so much, all of you, for coming. Thank you so much for these questions. Thank you so much to Adam for being the interlocutor and to Sharon for being the moderator. And really, it's been so illuminating. Thank you.